You wrote a book, Tamika's New Dress, right? That deals with a huge problem in our schools, bullying. What advice would you give to children and their parents who are experiencing in-person and cyberbullying?
So I'm gonna start with Tamika's New Dress. So Tamika's New Dress was a book I wrote from the vantage point of being a social worker and working with kids that were being bullied. And as a counselor, I'm sure you worked in a school with school counselors. Bullying is like the number one thing that kids have to deal with. And then going back to Howard Stevenson and talking about racial literacy and dealing with conflict. When you go to school, there's no classes on conflict management. there's no classes on, now you have social emotional, classes, but back then they didn't really deal with that. They didn't really teach you how to manage conflict. And a lot of times people manage conflicts, they go back to fists. We're gonna fight. I'm gonna joke you. We're gonna do the dozens. I'm gonna make fun of your mom. Kids have a way of dealing with conflict, but it's not always healthy. So with Tamika's New Dress, I wanted to create a book of a young lady who's dealing with conflict, dealing with childhood trauma, but finding a way to articulate, to communicate, to verbalize why she's upset, in hopes that can, create a friendship versus creating another enemy. And for her, her dress sort of provided her with a source of confidence. For me, Jordans, I feel like Michael Jordan with the Jordans on, or you got the first day of school outfit, you feel so good, you feel fresh, you probably feel like you can get straight A's all through the school year. So sometimes you have to find outside things to help build that inner confidence up. And for the dress, I asked my illustrator to make it an African style dress, because for me, I think us understanding our culture, I just came back from Atlanta and I had a chance. They have in the High Art Museum, they have an exhibit there of Nubia. So this Nubian exhibit, when I was in school, I was really focused on consciousness and focused on learning and understanding my cultural identity. And that's the piece too that gave me another level of confidence, is knowing who I am and understanding, where I came from. So for me, being able to actually see this art, from 860 BC, to see art of Taharka, a pharaoh, he was a pharaoh of Egypt. And to see this, I wasn't able to touch it, but I could see it. I could smell it, and to know that, wow, black kings really existed. Egypt or Kemet, that was a black civilization. Growing up again in a rural area, my town is right next. So George Washington was born about 30 minutes away. Robert E. Lee was born about 35 minutes away. There's plantations all around, where I'm from. The Confederacy is really big. So growing up, they weren't empowering you on Nubia and Taharka. The Egyptians were white in the school book, so when you grew up, you learned that if you learn how to read, they cut your hand off, so it was almost like they were sort of conditioning the black students that, you don't really have this academic thing ain't really for you. We watched the Ernest Green story. Kids trying to go to school, you got to have a National Guard there. You got the dogs attacking the students. But they never start in Africa. Everything starts at slavery. Everything starts at Jamestown, which is not that far from, where I live at. And it goes from there. But it's really no sense of like cultural identity. So when I wrote Tamika's New Dress, her grandmother sews her this dress, and I chose a grandmother because there's so many kids being raised by their grandparents because their parents either incarcerated, on drugs, or there's multiple kids, they get removed from the home. So I wanted to have the grandmother because I feel like there's also a disconnect between the elders and the youth. And I think there's so much wisdom with our elders that our youth, they need that and they want that and they desire that. But because the parents aren't necessarily there, involved, or able or capable of providing that, there's sort of this gap. So her grandmother sews this African style dress. And when she go to school, she thinks she the it, So she flexing a little bit. And that girl like, oh, so now you think you got this dress, now you think you African queen. And she's like, yeah, I am. You know what I'm saying? And she's able to sort of verbalize that conflict in a way to where she can like, I know who I am, but what's wrong with you? And in therapy, and even now, sometimes it's not right to ask what's wrong with you. Sometimes you should ask what happened to you. Because when you say what's happened to you, that can open up a lot of conversation versus what's wrong with you, because you already give me the impression something's wrong with me, for one. But what happened to you? So for instance, Tamika's lighter skin. So I want to deal with colorism in the book too. So Tamika's lighter, the other character's darker. So there's kind of this conflict there. But because we haven't really dealt with this issue as a community, we haven't dealt with colorism. And I think kids are a lot more accepting now. But when I was in school, if you were really dark skinned, you got teased. You know, you got picked on. Light skinned girls got teased for being light. However,
it's still the same vibe.
It's still the same, but however, being lighter, it does come with some level of privilege, versus, you know, when you dark skinned,
Bottom of the barrel.
bottom of the barrel. So I wanted to create a story where you have these two characters who initially kind of beefing, but they find a commonality. They have a bond, they have a friendship, because for so long, whether it was the Willie Lynch or whether there's always been a sort of, whether it was direct or indirect, there's always been division within culture. Now, you see this whole thing with foundational Black Americans versus, you know, Black Americans who were, you know, whose ancestors were enslaved here. But when I started college, the first book I read was The Philosophy of the Opinions of Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey, his birthday is a few days apart from mine. Like, Marcus Garvey, for me, was one of the most inspirational figures I've ever learned about, but I never heard about him in school. I never learned about Marcus Garvey until I went to college and I was in the library just looking up, you know, cultural books, and I ran into his book, and I'm like, wow, he had an organization that had thousands more people than the NAACP. He started a black ship line. He wanted to create commerce between Africa, the islands, and America. Like, he created his own military outfit. Like, the things that he did, like, it wouldn't be no Nation of Islam if it wasn't for Marcus Garvey. Like, there wouldn't be this push on black banks. There would be no Malcolm X, because his father was a Garveyite. So it's like, how did we just completely erase Marcus Garvey from history? You know, and he inspired me. Like, the ideas that I had and I thought about, he already did it over 100 years ago, but you know nothing about him. So, you know, for me, again, that cultural aspect, again, I'm going to get back to the bullying thing. I need to go back to that question. For me, as a therapist, I take bullying seriously, because a lot of times when the kids I see get bullied, there's a lot of suicidal ideation, there's a lot of cutting, there's a lot of issues around bullying that can really impact the child deeper than their feelings being hurt. I think the best thing to do, and some kids aren't really good at dealing with conflict, but you have to educate, empower, and teach the kid how to address it verbally. So in communication, they talk about aggressive communication, passive aggressive, and assertive. And I think teaching your kid how to be assertive. So when you're assertive, you're not like attacking a person. You're not being aggressive, but you're also not being passive. You're being able to state how you feel, to articulate your feelings, and to set a boundary, you know, and then if a person crosses that boundary, then you have a response to that. I think people used to laugh in school when white kids would be like, you know, Jennifer, that really hurt my feelings. You know, what you said, it really hurt my feelings because blah, 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 blah. And a lot of times people think that's whack and that's corny, but really it's the person being assertive. You're letting that person know, you hurt my feelings. This is what you did to hurt your feelings. This is what they did to hurt your feelings, and this is how you want to be treated. And I think with us, there's that vulnerability piece. You don't even want to tell a person you're hurting your feelings, because then you feel like you're being weak, you're being vulnerable. So I would say, as far as bullying, I think that first we need to, you know, empower our kids to stand up for themselves. And, you know, fighting is one way to stand up to yourself, but I always think about a toolbox. You know, you got a bunch of different tools. With police, they talk about the continuum of force. First, they say their uniform is the first thing. So when you see that uniform, you should already be able to comply. Then there's that verbal command, stop what you're doing. And then it's pepper spray. Then it's, you know, it's a level of continuum. I think as kids, they need to have a toolbox. There needs to be a continuum. Some things you might have to ignore. You know, some things you might have to address indirectly. Then you might have to address it directly. Then you might have to get an adult involved. Then you might have to get your parent involved. then you might have to, unfortunately, sometimes have to put your hands on a person. But we want to reserve that for later. We don't want that to be the first recourse, because I always believe in teachable moments, and I always believe you teach people how to treat you. And if you are a person with strong boundaries, because everybody went to school with that person who they didn't even have to really talk, nobody messed with them.
They set that tone.
They set that tone from the door, and they already let you know you're not going to do this to me. And that was a protective mechanism. Something could have happened to them where they know I got to set my boundaries really strong, because I don't want nobody interrupting my peace. So there's a continuum, and I think if we teach kids about this continuum and then treat the mutual respect thing, we have to, I think with kids, especially black kids and probably Hispanic, it's like a pecking order. When you go to school, you see white kids, you see everybody getting along for the most part. But with us, it's always a pecking order. Who's going to be on the top? Who's going to be on the bottom? And, and that sort of fosters that bullying attitude. I remember mentoring a kid in Portsmouth, Virginia. And, he was like, in my school, everybody a bully. And the bullies just bully other bullies. So it's just a level of everybody is defending themselves. And how can you really get anything done? And also Portsmouth historically has had one of the highest murder rates, in the state and in that region. So when you got bullies bullying, it's going to lead to a higher level of force and a higher level of violence, because there's no communication, there's no talking. When I worked in prison, I always tell people I felt more safe being at the prison than I felt on the street. You don't see guys fighting a lot in certain prisons, because you could just interrupt your good time, you can get locked down. There's so many different consequences to where you actually think about, do I really want to interrupt my peace? Do I really want to disrupt? I'm not able to be home, but do I really want to disrupt a little bit of peace and security I have in this situation? And I think when you take away the guns, you take away different things, then people learn how to be creative. The officers don't have guns in prisons either. So that officer on the street might be rah, 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 get on the floor, do what I say. But in prison, you got 80 guys in one pod and you by yourself. You might not be able to run things, that way. So I think when you put people in situations where they have to be forced to communicate and learn how to communicate and learn how to compromise and learn how to use their resources, you can create a more wholesome person. But if a person feel like their only recourse is to fight, then you're never going to really deal with bullying, because you're going to deal with, then you got to deal with, because in Virginia, you get into a fight, that is creating a charge. You get charged now. Now you got to deal with the court system. So you got to have different levels of communication, verbal communication, and be more assertive, not aggressive, be assertive.